Hi, thank you for joining me for this episode of Virtual Vitamin Z, where we bring the zoo to you. I'm Erin, and I'm the Nature Center's Manager and Field Conservation Officer for the Detroit Zoological Society, and I'm here at the Belle Nature Center with an update on bird feeding in the summer and sort of talking about what we're seeing and hearing right now and what we can expect to hear and see in the next month or so. It's a great time to be observing birds because there's a lot of seasonal changes happening. All right, today's vocabulary includes molt. So birds will frequently go through one or even two molts a year where they lose all or most of their feathers. And this time of year, it can be quite dramatic. So I'm going to show you some images so we get used to seeing what birds might look like at our feeders this time of year. We also have the term migration, and we often think of bird migration as really happening in the spring as one of those signs of the end of winter. But the fall migration is actually also really important, even though it's maybe a little bit less visible to us. So again, I'm going to show you some things to look for and some ways to help birds as they prepare for their fall migration southward. Then we have the term phenology, and phenology is the study of the changing seasons and those events that take place during the change of seasons. And it's a wonderful way to be tapped into what is happening in your backyard and your wildlife here and connect to what's happening elsewhere in the world. Phenological events encompass all kinds of natural events, from the first arrival of some of our spring songbirds in early March and April to the arrival of our dark-eyed juncos and some of our other winter feeder birds. And so tying into phenological knowledge is a depth of understanding and attention paid to what is happening in our backyards with our wildlife and our plants. So along with that, today's skills are observation, so looking, listening, thinking about what's happening outside, and also ecological knowledge. So what animals are here now, what's happening with them, where will they be a month from now or 2 months from now, and what to expect as the seasons start to change in September, October, and November. All right, so let's talk about molt. So if you look at this male cardinal, this is our northern cardinal, you are going to notice that his feathers look quite patchy. He does not look great. And so this is one of the signs of molt. If we look at him, he still has a clear looking eye. If he had a cloudy or inflamed eye, I would be concerned about disease. But this time of year, we're really starting to see, especially our resident birds, birds that live here all year round, really start to go through a seasonal molt. So molt happens typically after the breeding season. So these birds have raised their young, and they might still be feeding some young, but probably not in the nest anymore. And so they lose a lot of their feathers. Here's another example of that. Many birds will lose all of the feathers on their head. And again, I'm looking to see this. This is our blue jay. And that blue jay, again, has a clear eye. I don't see any signs of inflammation around it. It doesn't perhaps look super attractive, but it's going to lose those feathers and regrow them. So feathers get a lot of wear and tear on them during the season. And for our resident birds, the blue jay, the cardinal, some of our others, they need really strong weatherproof feathers to get them through the winter. So they're going to put on a whole new set of feathers. They go through this short-term phase where the old feathers fall out. You can see the little pin feathers sticking out of its head here. As they grow in, they will grow in, and then this bird will have clean new feathers to get it through the winter. Okay, something else that's happening though that's a bit of a reverse of what we were seeing in the last few slides are American goldfinch, which is again basically a year-round resident, or perhaps a very short distance migrant if it's going to follow some food sources in the winter, comes off of this sort of dull olive green plumage into its vibrant breeding plumage. And the reason for this is because this bird is not migrating long distances. They tend to nest later than some of our other birds. And so they come into their breeding plumage and leave that breeding plumage a bit later. So that's a fun one to have at your feeders this time of year. All right, something else that's happening right now is the return to our bird feeders of some of our year-round resident birds. So this is a tufted titmouse. I took this picture here at the Nature Center. We have at least one pair that is here year-round, but they basically vanish from the seed feeders during the months of, from about mid-May to about mid-July. The reason for that is that most of our songbirds, even those that are seed eaters the rest of the year, and even things like hummingbirds that are nectar feeders most of the year, when they are raising young in the nest, those young can go from an egg to a fledged baby in less than a month. And so they have to put on weight extremely quickly. And insects, especially things like caterpillars, arthropods like spiders, are basically a little packet of fat and protein. And those are the things that these baby birds need to grow really rapidly into adulthood and fledge the nest. And so while our parent birds are on the nest, they are heading out in search of insects and arthropods all day long. They are consuming them, they're feeding them to their babies. So when I start seeing our resident birds start showing up at the feeders, which I have over the last few days, I know that they have probably finished raising their last brood of young, and probably are seeing more diversity again at your bird feeders, even if it's a slow trickle of diversity, is signifying to me kind of the end of the breeding season. All right. Something else that is happening right now at the feeders is all of those young, the fledglings, are starting to show up in our yards and at our feeders. And so a couple of things. Here is a juvenile robin, here's a juvenile starling, and here is a juvenile English sparrow or house sparrow. And so a couple of things here. These are normal stages of bird development. So a fledgling bird can get out of the nest and flap its wings a little bit, but for a couple of days it really cannot fly. So we find them on the ground or in places where we think they shouldn't be and we think they've been abandoned. Typically, the parent birds are still feeding, bringing water, managing the bird. This is a very normal stage of development. So the first thing is, if you're finding young birds, we want to just leave them alone and make some observations about what is happening with them. If we do know that there's an immediate threat, a neighborhood dog or a feral cat or something like that, traffic, we can gently scoop them up, put them into a shrub or a tree very close to where you're at, because the parents are probably watching. It is a myth that the scent of our skin will prevent the parent from feeding it. That is not true. What we don't want to do is scoop this baby up and take it somewhere to get rehabilitated if the parents are still around. So it's very common that these babies are going to hop around, look pretty pathetic to us humans. They will be begging for food. Their mouths will be wide open. A lot of times you'll see the parent just constantly coming and bringing it food. And so this is a totally normal phase of development. You will also start seeing them come to your feeders. I always joke that these are teenage birds. They've been kind of kicked out of the nest. They're past that fledgling stage, maybe not quite ready to feed themselves all the way yet. And so they're often begging their parents. You'll see them flapping their wings a lot and opening what we call the gape, so their wide open bill, begging a parent to put food in it. And this is happening at the feeders too. They are fully capable of feeding themselves. They just are not quite ready to sever the ties with mom and dad. So this is a great time of year to start putting out your hummingbird feeders again. Ruby-throated hummingbirds are the one species that we really find regularly here in Michigan, will be fueling up for their migration south. If you want to put in nectar, we want to make sure of a couple of things. We want it to be 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. We do not want to purchase pre-made hummingbird food with the red dye in it. That red dye is actually not great for the birds. And actually, we really just want to make sure we're using plain white table sugar, certainly no sugar substitutes, because that does not provide fuel to the birds. But also not things like brown or raw sugar, because those can also harm the birds. You can imagine hummingbird is a very small organism with a very small liver, and we don't want to stress it out in any way. Their metabolism is really high. They're taking in a lot of energy in the form of sugar as fuel, and we just want to make sure that we are keeping everything clean. This is a time of year where we probably want to put a little bit less nectar in the feeder and change it more regularly, because these warm afternoons it'll ferment really quickly. The other thing to watch for is the black mold that grows on the ports. If you have 2 feeders and you can clean one and swap in the other one, that's what we do pretty regularly here, to just keep on top of those things that would potentially cause harm to the hummingbirds. If you have a lot of feeders, this is a fun time to put them out, because as you may have noticed, hummingbirds are very territorial. And so if you put out several feeders, you may attract more hummingbirds, because each one, especially the adult males, will guard a feeder. They may let juvenile, immature, young of the year come in, and they may let females come in, but you can attract more birds if you have more feeders. One other piece of mythology that I hear every year about hummingbird feeders, we are not keeping them here beyond their quote unquote normal migration by providing food. Birds are not going to be stuck in Michigan over the winter because of our hummingbird feeders. You should definitely take them down before the first hard frost comes, because you don't want the nectar freezing in there and damaging your feeder. But birds will migrate, they will find nectar, and often they're gone before our frost even starts to happen here in Michigan. Okay, if you had oranges out for the Orioles in April, you can try again with them. They definitely were not visiting a whole lot during the peak of summer, although some people's Orioles continue to visit, probably non-breeding Orioles. This is a great time, if you want to see them again, to try to put out an orange half or two. You can just poke it on a nail, or you can have an actual Oriole feeder. This is a great time, again, as they are getting ready to migrate and they have raised their young for the year. Okay, and then in terms of seed feeding, we use a mixed seed here. There's a picture of it there. What I do recommend to people, if you're trying to reduce the mess at your bird feeder, is just find a straight safflower or sunflower seed mix with just or oil seed, it's marketed as different things, with just the black seeds here. When we feed these mixes, we know that we're losing a lot. You'll watch the birds sit at the feeder and pick out the seeds that they want and throw the ones that they don't want. We're less concerned about the mess here. We do clean it up pretty regularly and monitor what else is visiting the feeder. We want to be very careful that we're not regularly feeding deer, as the DNR is trying to put some boundaries on the spread of chronic wasting disease in the white-tailed deer population. And so we don't want to encourage congregations of deer feeding at our birdseed waste. Another thing to think about is for the goldfinches and other finches, especially in the winter, we sometimes have great northern finches come down. We can start putting out our thistle feed, or our Niger is sometimes sold as. All right. Another thing to think about is what is happening in the garden right now. So goldfinches do nest later than other birds, primarily because they are utilizing the fuzzy tops of things like thistle for their nests, and they are eating those seeds. And so if you have a patch of your garden where a few things can go to seed, that can be a great fuel source for birds. And also, we'll talk about this more later, but at the end of the season, we want to keep some of that, those stalks and shrubs up and not mow them down to the ground for the winter, because it provides both food and shelter for the birds. So right now, if a few things are going to seed and you're willing to leave them, it's a great fuel source for birds and can be a really big attractant to your yard for birds. All right, so let's look at the things that we talked about. We want to make sure we're keeping our bird feeders clean and sanitized. We're filling them regularly with fresh food. We're maybe letting some of our garden plants go to seed. Some of those coneflowers are great. Bergamot is great. If we've got a hummingbird feeder out, we're changing that nectar regularly. I make mine and put it in the and put all the excess in the fridge so that I can change it out every couple of days so it doesn't start to ferment and potentially harm the birds. And then we're going to enjoy the changing of the seasons. This is not a time of year that we talk about phenological events very often, and yet there's so much going on. Okay, and so today's activity, and hopefully it's something that you'll do beyond today, is to think about creating a nature journal and monitoring phenological events in your backyard. It can be such a nice way to be in touch with the seasons and be in touch with those seasonal changes and events that we refer to collectively as phenology. So if you have a nature journal, a notebook, a pad of paper, something very simple, that is great. If you want to make a nature journal, all I used was some corrugated cardboard that is cut to size with holes punched in it. I've got some recycled paper pages that I'm going to slide in here. And then I can either fasten them together with brads or with book rings. And then I can just start writing or sketching or painting the things that I see. And it's a great way to make observations. And again, You don't need to know exactly what the organism is that you're looking at. Your nature journal can be a great record of what happens over time, and it can be a great record for you to use to help identify things if you want to use the sketching and the writing that you've done to then look things up online or in a field guide. I hope you enjoyed this quick update on what is happening in our bird feeders. If you have pictures of birds at your bird feeder that you're wondering about, or if you have started or are working on a nature journal and have some sketches or some writing that you'd like to share, we'd love to see that. You can send that to education@dzs.org. If you're looking for other opportunities for virtual education, you can check out our website at detroitzoo.org. And under the Education tab, you'll find all of our virtual ventures. All right, we would love to see you back at the zoo or the Belle Isle Nature Center someday soon. And in the meantime, take care of each other and stay healthy.